As we discussed in our previous video, tensions had been building between Britain and her American colonies for years prior to 1775. And by that year, things were at a boiling point. And so when a call went out for armed resistance to the oppressive rule of King George II, thousands of colonial militia answered the call, and two would be the pivotal figures in this conflict. One was a 22-year-old field officer by the name of George Washington, and the other, an experienced but controversial general by the name of William Howe. This is their story, and the story of the Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775. It's me, and this is Kings and Generals. The year before, 1774, had seen escalating hostilities between the colonies and the Crown leading up to the now infamous Boston Tea Party in December. In response, the British government passed a series of punitive acts, which only inflamed the situation further. In May 1775, confrontations along the Massachusetts-New Hampshire border resulted in the battles of Lexington and Concord. These were the opening engagements of the war, and they occurred on June 19th. We covered these battles in some detail in our last video on the American Revolution, including the events surrounding the British Army's retreat from Concord after being harassed by colonial militia. But it is important to quickly recap them, because the fallout from these battles would have a major impact on the events of today. When the British regulars returned to Boston, they did so under fire from the militia, which forced them to take up defensive positions. Within the city, they were soon reinforced by additional British units stationed in Canada and elsewhere in the colonies. As more troops arrived, it became clear to all sides that a decisive engagement was imminent. As such, both the Patriots and the British began to take up positions around the city, the Americans in particular on the hills overlooking the British garrison. At this time, the colonial militia numbered around 20,000 men in New England alone. The majority of these were volunteers. Under the command of General Artemas Ward, the Provincial Congress established the Continental Army with George Washington as its commander-in-chief. Washington joined the army near Boston in late June and took command from General Ward. Though he had little military experience, Washington was well liked by the men and understood the political ramifications of this conflict. The British, on the other hand, were commanded by Lieutenant General William Howe, who was tasked with suppressing the rebellion and restoring order to the colonies. Despite having the advantage in numbers, Howe was hesitant to engage the colonial militia in battle, fearful of the unknown capabilities of his enemy. He also hoped that the conflict could still be resolved peacefully, and so was reluctant to open hostilities. However, the British public demanded action, and so Howe decided to seize the heights around Boston to force the Americans into open battle. On June 17, 1775, British forces advanced on the American position at Bunker Hill, actually known today as Breed's Hill, situated at the northern end of the Charlestown Peninsula. It overlooked the city of Boston and was connected to the high ground on the neighboring hill of Bunker Hill. By the time the British reached the base of the hill, the Americans had completed 3 lines of fortifications, each consisting of low breastworks and some redoubts. The first line was deployed across the summit of the hill, the second protected the slopes of the hill, and the third line guarded the approaches from the east. The American force defending these works consisted of about 2,500 militia and 600 members of the 1st and 2nd Continental Artillery Regiments. Howe began by sending out skirmishers to probe the American defenses. They were driven back with loss, however, and so Howe ordered the main attack. The assault was launched by nearly 2,500 British regulars. The first assault began just before noon and was directed against the center of the American lines on Breed's Hill. 5 British battalions attacked in column, advancing across the open ground in front of the American breast. They were heavily outnumbered, but the British soldiers were elite, highly disciplined troops, having undergone rigorous training and led by experienced officers. When the British came within 50 yards of the American defenses, the order was given to fire. The air filled with smoke and the crack of musket fire. A large portion of the attackers fell, and those who survived scattered in confusion. When they rallied and reformed, the Americans fired again, inflicting even greater casualties. Again and again, the British advanced, only to be driven back by the deadly accurate fire from the American militia. The British eventually reformed and renewed the attack. Pushing forward with fixed bayonets, they charged through the smoke and over the breastworks, capturing several of them and engaging in fierce close quarters, fighting with the Americans. Although the British succeeded in forcing the Americans out of some of their trenches, they were unable to dislodge them completely from the remainder of the hill. They then attempted to outflank the Americans on the left, but were repelled as well. Eventually, the British commander ordered another general assault. Meanwhile, the American ammunition began to run low, and many muskets were too worn or damaged to effectively fire. By the time the British launched their final assault, the Americans had used up most of their ammunition, and were forced to rely on their pistols or deliver blows with their bayonets and other weapons. Though the British achieved success in driving the Americans from their fortifications, the cost was very high. In fact, by this point, almost a third of the attacking force had become casualties. Unable to commit any more troops to the assault, General Howe ordered the surviving troops to withdraw. The battle was over. The Americans lost around 140 men killed and wounded, while the British suffered 226 casualties. The victory was not without its costs, however, and the importance of the battle cannot be overstated. It demonstrated the tenacity of the colonial militia and the prowess of the British Army. To the Americans, the battle was a morale booster, proving that they could stand toe-to-toe with the finest army in the world and come out on top. Even though they had lost the hill, the battle was still considered a tactical victory. General Howe, on the other hand, was stunned by the colonial defense of Bunker Hill. He realized that the war would not be the cakewalk he had anticipated, and that defeating this ragtag group of rebels would be more difficult than he imagined. The toll the battle took on his seasoned troops was staggering. As well, of the 5 battalions that had assaulted the hill, only 2 remained intact. The others had suffered such heavy casualties that they were broken up and incorporated into other units. In the aftermath of the battle, Howe began to take steps to strengthen his defenses around Boston and consolidate his position. His plan was to evacuate the city and establish a new fortified camp in the north. While Howe withdrew his troops, Washington moved his headquarters closer to the front lines and prepared to take advantage of any potential British attack, but Howe never made any attempt to resume the offensive, instead preferring to build up his forces and entrench himself firmly in his new position. This inactivity frustrated the Americans, who demanded that Washington take the offensive and drive the British from Boston. Tensions rose between Washington and some of the New England governors, who felt that decisive action should be taken immediately to drive the British out of the colonies once and for all. Washington, however, knew that his troops were inexperienced and lacked the supplies and training for a sustained campaign. Instead, he chose to bide his time until he was ready to deal a decisive blow. Meanwhile, the stalemate continued, and the war for American independence was just beginning. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. It really helps us out. Also, subscribe to our channel for more videos like this one. Special thanks to our supporters whose names you can see on screen right now. We've got some more videos coming up on the American Revolution, and we hope you enjoy them. See you next time.